I've always liked being outdoors. I wouldn't call myself an expert camper, but I knew my way around a campsite, how to build a fire, and how to stay safe in the woods. I had been camping for years, but nothing had ever truly scared me. That changed in the summer of 2016. I had just turned 29, and I wanted to spend a weekend alone in the woods. My life had been feeling a bit dull: work, home, sleep, repeat. I needed a break from people, from noise, from responsibilities. So I packed my gear and drove out to a place I had never camped before. It was a dense forest in the northern part of the state, not too far from a national park, but still isolated enough that I wouldn't run into many people. The drive was long, and the roads got rougher the deeper I went into the forest. The last stretch was a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my truck. The trees on either side were thick and old, and the undergrowth was dense. I had to drive carefully, making sure I didn't get stuck in the soft earth. Eventually, I found a clearing that seemed good enough. It wasn't a designated campsite, but I wasn't worried. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food and water for a few days. I planned to hike around, maybe do some fishing at a nearby river I had read about. I parked the truck, grabbed my gear, and walked a little deeper into the woods to set up camp. I found a spot about a 5-minute walk from where I had parked. It was surrounded by tall trees, giving me plenty of shade, and had just enough space for my tent and a small fire pit. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I spent the rest of the day setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and making sure I had everything I needed close by. As the sun started to set, I lit a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and just sat there, enjoying the quiet. The forest at night had a different kind of beauty, one that made you feel small, like you were just another creature in the wild. As the fire crackled, I noticed how dark it had gotten. The trees were so thick that barely any moonlight got through. I could only see a few feet beyond the glow of my fire. I wasn't scared, but there was a certain uneasiness about it, not knowing what was beyond that darkness. I forced myself to shake off the feeling. I had camped before. I knew what the woods were like at night. The mind plays tricks when all you have is silence and shadows. I went into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down in my sleeping bag. It didn't take long for me to fall asleep. I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't. It was something moving through the undergrowth. A slow, deliberate movement, not the quick scurry of a small animal, not the rustling of leaves in the breeze. This was different. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound was coming from my left, near where I had stacked my firewood. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the side of my tent. Through the thin fabric, I could see the vague outline of something just beyond the light. My heart started pounding. A deer, maybe, but deer usually moved in quick, sudden steps. This was slower, heavier. I waited. The sound stopped. I stayed still for what felt like forever, listening, but I heard nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal passing through. Maybe a raccoon or a fox. Something harmless. I turned off my flashlight and lay back down, trying to calm myself. But just as I started to relax, the sound came back. This time, it was closer. It was right outside my tent. I froze. The footsteps were slow, careful, like whatever was out there was trying not to be heard. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my palms sweating. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped again. Couldn't breathe. The silence stretched on. I knew that whatever was out there was still standing close, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I didn't dare move. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Then, slowly, I reached for the zipper of my tent. If it was an animal, I needed to scare it off. If it was something else, someone else, I needed to know. I yanked the zipper down and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. Just the trees, the fire pit, the stacked firewood. No signs of anything moving.
No footprints.
No broken branches. I scanned the area for a long time, my hands still gripping the flashlight. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening, waiting, but the sound never came back. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near my firewood, the dirt was disturbed, not by an animal, but by something larger. There were no clear footprints, but the ground was uneven, like something heavy had been standing there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. But then I found something else. By a tree, a little further from my tent, was a piece of cloth. Dark, torn, caught on a low branch. It wasn't mine. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. This wasn't a popular camping spot. I hadn't seen another person for miles. I packed my gear faster than I ever had before. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time, scanning the trees, the bushes, every shadow. I didn't know if someone had been watching me, or if they were still out there. I hiked back to my truck and threw my gear in the back. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I turned the key, and the truck roared to life. That's when I saw it. A figure, far back between the trees. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, didn't try to hide. They just stood there, watching. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot on the gas, kicking up dirt as I sped down the path. My hands were gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, with the forest far behind me. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that I wasn't alone. And whoever was out there, they had been watching me the whole time. I wasn't the kind of guy who usually went camping alone, but that weekend, I needed to get away. I had a lot on my mind. Work had been draining me, and life in the city felt too suffocating. I had been meaning to take a trip out into the wilderness for a while, and after putting it off for too long, I finally packed my gear, threw it into the back of my truck, and hit the road. The place I chose wasn't some well-known campsite with marked trails and other people around. I wanted to be alone. I wanted silence. I wanted to be surrounded by trees, fresh air, and the kind of darkness at night that only existed far away from civilization. The spot I picked was deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. It was the kind of place you only found if you knew exactly where you were going. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled like damp earth from a recent rain. The dirt road leading up to the clearing where I planned to set up camp was rough, barely more than a trail through the trees. My truck bounced over the uneven ground, tires slipping slightly in the mud, but I made it without too much trouble. I parked in the clearing, shut off the engine, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No car horns, no shouting people, no buzzing electricity. Just wind moving through the branches and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was exactly what I needed. I got out and started setting up my tent. The ground was still a little damp, but not enough to be a problem. I unfolded my camping chair and set it near the fire pit someone else had made in the past. The blackened stones and old ash told me that I wasn't the first to camp here, but I was definitely the only one here now. By the time I got everything set up, the sun was already starting to go down. The sky turned from gray to a dull orange, and the temperature dropped just enough to make me zip up my jacket. I gathered some firewood, lit a small fire, and cooked a simple meal over the flames. It wasn't anything special, just some canned beans and a few pieces of bread. But out here, it tasted better than anything I could have made at home. As I ate, I kept my ears open, listening to the woods around me. The forest had its own sounds, its own rhythm. The occasional rustling of leaves, the distant snap of a twig. Normal sounds, expected sounds. But then, sometime after the sun had fully set, I heard something different. Car engine. It was faint at first, a low rumbling in the distance. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, closer. I turned in my chair and looked back toward the road I had come in on. The trees blocked most of my view, but I could see the glow of headlights flickering through the gaps. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it was a ranger, maybe someone checking up on the area. But this wasn't a designated campsite, and as far as I knew, no one patrolled out here. My second thought was that it was another camper who happened to pick the same spot as me. But that didn't seem likely either. This place was hard to find, not the kind of place people just stumbled across. The car slowed as it reached the clearing. My fire cast long shadows across the trees as the headlights swept over me. It was a police car that set off a small alarm in the back of my mind. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't breaking any laws. But something about seeing that patrol car out here, in the middle of nowhere, didn't sit right with me. The car rolled to a stop a few feet away from my truck. The driver's door opened, and a cop stepped out. He was alone. The first thing I noticed about him was that he was tall, solidly built, with broad shoulders and the kind of posture that told me he was used to people listening to him. His uniform looked slightly wrinkled, like he'd been wearing it for too long. His face was rough, with sharp features and dark, tired eyes. I didn't say anything. I just watched as he stood there, looking at me, and he just stood there, not speaking, not moving, just staring. Something about that moment stretched too long. Normally, if a cop wanted to talk to you, they'd make it known right away. They'd walk up, maybe ask for ID, ask what you were doing. But he didn't do any of that. He just stood next to his car, watching me like he was trying to decide something. Finally, after what felt like forever, he took a step forward. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. I had an instinct, a bad one. My brain was telling me to be careful, that something wasn't right. The way he was moving, it wasn't normal. It wasn't the kind of walk a cop did when they were coming to check on someone. It was slow, purposeful, like he had already made up his mind about something. I shifted slightly in my chair, my body tensing, and then he reached for his belt. I didn't think, I just reacted. I pushed myself up, backing away from the fire, keeping my eyes on his hands. And that's when I saw it. The gun. Not his service weapon. Not the one strapped to his side. A different one. One he had pulled from the back of his belt. Small, black, unmarked. I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that he wasn't here on official business. And he wasn't planning on leaving a witness. Panic shot through me like ice water. I turned, bolting toward my truck, my boots slipping slightly in the mud. I heard him behind me, moving fast, and then the first gunshot rang out. A deafening crack split the night, and something whizzed past my shoulder, close enough that I felt the heat of it. I kept running. My truck was just a few steps away. Another shot. This one hit the side of my truck with a metallic thunk. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the keys as another shot shattered the driver's side mirror. I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I shot forward, barely missing the police car. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cop standing there, guns still raised, watching me go. He didn't chase me. He didn't have to. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I parked outside a gas station, hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. I could have called the police. I could have reported it. But then I thought about it. A cop, out there in the woods, alone, trying to kill me with an unmarked gun. No body cams.
No witnesses.
No evidence. Would they even believe me? I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. And then, slowly, I set it down. I didn't go back for my camping gear. I didn't go back for anything. I just drove, and I never camped alone again. I had been camping alone for years. It wasn't about proving anything to myself, it was just something I enjoyed. The quiet, the disconnect from the world, the feeling of being completely alone with nothing but nature around me. It was peaceful, and I always came back from my trips feeling more clear-headed than when I left. This trip wasn't any different at first. It was the middle of September, a perfect time to be in the woods. The air was cool but not too cold, and the trees had just started turning. I had picked a remote spot in the mountains, deep in a forest where the nearest town was at least an hour's drive away. I liked it that way. The fewer people around, the better. I arrived in the afternoon, set up my tent, and gathered enough firewood to last through the night. I wasn't worried about wildlife. I had camped in places with bears and mountain lions before, and as long as you took the right precautions, there was nothing to be afraid of. At least that's what I had always believed. As the sun started setting, I cooked a simple meal over the fire and sat back in my chair, listening to the sounds of the woods. The usual noises were all there: the rustling of small animals, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of the wind through the trees. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames, enjoying the solitude. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the brush, but the sound was off. It wasn't the quick, light movement of a deer or the skittering of a raccoon. It was slow, deliberate, heavy, like something was walking on two legs, not four. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The fire crackled in front of me, but beyond that, the woods had gone eerily silent.
No insects.
No distant owl calls, just the sound of something moving, stopping, then moving again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a big animal that just sounded strange in the darkness. I forced myself to ignore it, finished my meal, and crawled into my tent. The night was long. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside. Footsteps, breathing. At one point, I swore I heard something brush against the side of my tent, but every time I looked out, there was nothing there, just darkness. By morning, I felt stupid for letting my imagination get the best of me. I had been out in the woods plenty of times, and I knew how sounds could play tricks on your mind at night. I shook it off and went about my day, hiking deeper into the forest, gathering more firewood, and making sure I had plenty of supplies. That night, things got worse. I had just started to doze off when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. I held my breath, gripping the knife I always kept next to me. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could feel something standing there, close enough that I could hear the faintest sound of breathing. Then, in the darkness, I heard my own voice. It was distant at first, like it was coming from deep in the woods, but it was my voice. I recognized it immediately. It was saying something I had said earlier that day, just a few words, but in the exact tone and rhythm I had spoken them. A cold chill ran down my spine. I've heard animals mimic sounds before. Birds can do it, even some predators. But this wasn't an animal. It was me, my voice, repeating something I had said hours earlier. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The footsteps started again, moving around the tent, slow and steady. I forced myself to look out just for a second. I wish I hadn't. Standing just beyond the dying fire was a shape. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long limbs that didn't move quite right. Its skin was stretched too tight, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wasn't human, not completely, but it was trying to be. I couldn't see its face, not fully, but I knew it wasn't right. The way it stood, the way it moved, everything about it felt wrong. Then, in that same awful imitation of my own voice, it spoke again. Just one word this time. Help! I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, as if it had lost interest, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't pack up, didn't try to make a run for my car. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to come up. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up everything as fast as I could and started the long hike back to my truck. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I didn't even take a break to drink water. I just kept moving. I never saw it again, but I heard it. Somewhere behind me, deep in the trees, I heard my own voice. It was saying something I hadn't said. See you soon. I didn't look back. I got in my truck, drove straight home, and never went camping alone again. I don't camp alone anymore. I used to love it, the solitude, the quiet hum of nature, the feeling of being cut off from the world in the best way. I had done it for years, ever since I was a teenager. But there are some things you don't come back from the same, things that shift the way you see the world. This happened in 2016. I was 29 years old, working as a welder in Oregon. My job was good, but it took up most of my time, and when I got a rare long weekend, I took off into the woods. I knew a place about 2 hours from where I lived, near a winding river, tucked deep into the mountains. Hardly anyone went there. That was the appeal. I packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, my old hunting knife, and enough food and water for a couple of nights. I had a habit of keeping my truck close to my site, just in case I needed to leave fast. I'd learned that from a run-in with a bear a few years back. The drive up was peaceful. The roads turned from pavement to dirt, the trees growing thicker on either side. I had picked a spot just off an old service road, about a 10-minute hike from where I parked. The river ran nearby, its constant rush a kind of background noise that always helped me sleep. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat by the river for a while. I watched the sun sink behind the trees, listened to the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of evening that made me feel alive, that made me think I could do this forever. I turned in early, zipped up my tent, and let the sound of the water lull me to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The air was still, the fire just embers. Then I heard it. Twigs snapping, slow, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal. Too steady, too careful. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing. I had my knife under my sleeping bag, a habit more than anything, but that night, I gripped it tight. My mind raced through the possibilities. A bear? No, a bear wouldn't stand still like that. Another camper? Unlikely, this place was too remote. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. Slow, steady, back into the woods. I lay awake until dawn, every sound making my pulse jump. When the sky turned gray with morning light, I unzipped my tent, stepping out cautiously. Nothing. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a deer passing too close. I pushed the unease down and went about my day. Hiked a little, fished in the river, tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But as the day wore on, I couldn't relax. Every time the wind rustled the branches, I flinched. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself to stay one more night. It was probably nothing. I had camped alone so many times before. I wasn't about to let my mind ruin it for me, but I made sure my fire was bigger that night. I kept my knife in my hand as I sat by the flames. I forced myself to stay awake for as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled into my tent and shut my eyes. The sound woke me up again. Footsteps, closer this time. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps stopped right outside my tent. Then the zipper moved. Slow, steady. I bolted upright, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. The zipper stopped halfway. Silence. I didn't move. Then, after an eternity, the zipper slid back down. The footsteps retreated. I don't know how long I sat there, knife in hand, listening. Eventually, the sky began to lighten. I waited until the sun was fully up before stepping outside. Nothing. Again, no tracks, no sign of anything. That was enough for me. I packed up as fast as I could, heart hammering, ears straining for any sound. I hiked back to my truck in record time, tossing my gear into the bed, barely checking to see if I had everything. I just wanted to be gone. I started the truck and turned onto the dirt road, tires kicking up dust. The further I got from my campsite, the lighter I felt. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. A figure stood in the trees, just off the road. Not moving, not hiding, just watching. I barely caught a glimpse before I was past him, but I knew what I saw. A man, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my doors locked, my knife on the nightstand. I never went back to that spot, and I never camp alone anymore. I was 33 the summer I decided to go camping alone in a remote part of Colorado. I'd always loved the outdoors, but life had gotten in the way over the years. Work kept me busy, and I hadn't taken a real break in a long time. So when I had a long weekend off, I packed up my gear and drove deep into the mountains, looking for a spot where I could be completely alone. I wasn't looking for a campground with other people. I wanted isolation. Just me, my tent, and the sounds of nature. I found a rough dirt road off the highway that led into the forest. I checked my GPS and saw that there weren't any major towns nearby. Perfect. The road was barely a road, more like two tire tracks cutting through the trees. It was slow going, and my truck bounced over rocks and dips, but after an hour, I found a clearing. There were no signs of other campers. No fire rings, no footprints, nothing. Just trees, mountains, and silence. I set up my tent near the tree-line, where I could see the clearing but still have some cover. It was late afternoon by the time I got everything settled. I started a fire, cooked some food, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. But the quiet felt off. I've been in the woods plenty of times, and I know what normal sounds like. The occasional rustle of an animal moving, the wind through the trees, insects buzzing. But this place was too quiet.
No birds, no crickets.
Nothing. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just one of those odd places where wildlife kept its distance. As the sun set, I kept the fire going, letting the warmth and light push back the creeping darkness. The temperature dropped fast, and the sky filled with stars. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was overthinking things. I was out in the middle of nowhere, alone. Of course, my mind would play tricks on me. By midnight, I forced myself to go to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, Something had snapped a branch outside my tent. I lay there, holding my breath. Could have been anything, a deer, maybe a raccoon. But then I heard another sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal. I had a gun in my bag, but I didn't want to reach for it too fast. I listened, hoping the noise would stop, but it didn't. The footsteps circled my tent. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. The steps were slow, almost careful. Not the random movement of an animal. Someone was moving around, checking my campsite. Then the steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing. My own heartbeat was so loud I thought it would give me away. I waited, praying whoever it was would just walk away. But they didn't. They stood there for what felt like forever. Then I heard something worse. The sound of my cooler opening. Whoever it was didn't just stumble upon my camp. They were searching through my stuff. I had two choices: stay silent and hope they left, or grab my gun and let them know I wasn't an easy target. I chose the second. Moving as quietly as I could, I reached for my bag and pulled out my handgun. Then, I cleared my throat just enough to make a sound. The footsteps stopped immediately. Then they moved away fast. I heard someone running into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At sunrise, I got out of the tent, gun in hand. The fire was nothing but embers, and my cooler was still open. But what really got me were the footprints. They weren't from boots. They weren't even from shoes. They were barefoot. Large, human footprints circling my tent. My stomach twisted. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away. And why would someone be walking barefoot in the middle of the woods at night? I decided I had enough. I packed up fast, stuffing everything into my truck. As I was loading up, I noticed something else. A tree near my campsite had something carved into it. 3 deep slashes like claw marks, but too deliberate. Almost like a warning. I didn't stick around to find out what it meant. I drove out of there as fast as I could, bumping down that dirt road, heart pounding the whole way. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me. I made it home, unpacked my gear, and tried to put it behind me, but the whole thing nagged at me, so I did some digging. I found an old article about that area. Decades ago, people used to live in those woods. A small, isolated group that cut off from the rest of the world. Eventually, they disappeared. Some said they left. Others said they died off. But there were stories. Hikers who went missing. Campers who vanished without a trace. People who came back from that area talking about strange noises. Figures moving in the trees. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I won't ever camp alone again. I never thought I would go camping alone again. After my wife passed, everything lost its meaning. The house felt empty. The days dragged on, and I found myself avoiding the places we used to go together. We had loved the outdoors, always picking a weekend to escape to the woods, away from noise and people. It was our thing. But after she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to do it. The idea of setting up camp, cooking by the fire, and sleeping under the stars without her felt wrong. But grief does strange things. One day, I just packed my gear and left. I didn't have a destination in mind, just drove until I reached an area deep in the woods, far from any towns or campsites. I wanted isolation. I wanted to be somewhere no one could find me. It was early September. The air was crisp but not yet cold. Leaves had started turning. A mix of gold and red scattered across the dirt path leading into the forest. I parked the truck at the side of an old logging road and hiked in. I had been here once before, years ago, back when she was still alive. The area was untouched. No trails, no signs of people. Just deep woods, stretching for miles in every direction. I walked for about an hour before finding a small clearing next to a stream. It was perfect. The sound of running water was soothing, and the thick trees around it blocked out most of the wind. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat by the stream for a while, just listening. It should have felt peaceful, but something was off. It was small things at first. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves from small animals moving around. Just silence. And then, as I was setting up my fire, I noticed something strange. The logs I had gathered were damp, even though it hadn't rained in days. It was like they had been sitting in water, but there was no flood, no sign of moisture anywhere else. I pushed the thought away and forced myself to focus on the fire. It took longer than usual, but I eventually got it going. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and watched the flames flicker. As the night deepened, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a sense that something wasn't right. At some point, I realized I wasn't alone. I don't mean I saw someone. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't catch a shadow moving between the trees. It was more of a feeling, an awareness that someone or something was watching me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the dim outlines of branches swaying in the breeze. But the feeling didn't go away. I stayed by the fire longer than I should have, delaying the moment I had to crawl into the tent. But eventually, exhaustion won. I doused the flames, zipped myself inside, and lay there, staring at the thin fabric separating me from the night. Sleep didn't come easy. I drifted in and out, every small sound jerking me awake. At some point, I heard something moving outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint shuffling, like someone stepping carefully around the campsite. I held my breath, then nothing. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I don't know how long I stayed like that, ears straining, waiting for another sound. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I faded into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the open tent flap. I always zipped it shut, always, but now it was half open, the cold morning air creeping in. I sat up slowly, every muscle tense. The fire pit was cold, the stream still ran, the trees still stood tall. Nothing looked out of place, but the tent flap, had I forgotten to zip it all the way? Had the wind pulled it open? I stepped outside, heart pounding. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They circled my campsite, leading up to the tent, stopping inches from the entrance. Bare feet, long and narrow, pressed deep into the dirt. I wasn't alone. A wave of nausea hit me. I scanned the woods, eyes darting between the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing against me like a weight. I needed to leave. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag without care. My hands were shaking. My breath came in short bursts. The forest was silent, unnaturally still. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Near the fire pit, half buried under leaves, was something small and dark. I stepped closer, stomach twisting. A bone. Not an animal bone. A human finger bone. My legs locked, breath catching in my throat. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, like the earth itself was shifting. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate exhale. Close. Too close. I didn't look back. I ran. I don't remember the hike back to the truck. I must have sprinted the whole way, crashing through branches, stumbling over roots. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear inside, jumped in, and peeled out of there without looking back. I didn't stop driving for hours. Even now, months later, I still don't know what I felt out there, or what was watching me. All I know is that I'll never go back, and I'll never camp alone again. I don't go camping anymore, not after what happened that night. This was a few years ago, back when I still enjoyed spending nights under the stars, away from everything. I used to find peace in the silence, in the way the world felt different when you were miles away from any town or city. The quiet used to be comforting. Now, it just reminds me of how alone you can be when something goes wrong. I was in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. It was late summer and the days were still warm, but the nights had started getting colder. I'd driven out to a spot I'd found the year before, remote, off the main road with a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. There was a river not far from my campsite, and I planned on fishing in the morning before heading back home. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing trip. The first few hours were normal. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, cooked some food, and just sat there, listening to the sounds of the woods. The sun went down and the temperature dropped fast. I pulled on a jacket and threw more wood on the fire. Everything felt normal, peaceful. At some point, I decided to walk down to the river. I took my flashlight and followed the narrow trail through the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. The sound of running water got louder as I got closer. When I reached the riverbank, I just stood there for a while, breathing in the cold air. The moon was bright enough that I could see the water moving, reflecting pale light between the dark trees. It was nice. Then I heard it, a rustling sound, not an animal. It was slow, deliberate, footsteps. I turned, aiming my flashlight toward the sound. The beam passed over trees, bushes, shadows. Nothing, but I knew I'd heard something. The woods had that heavy silence, the kind where you know something's watching. I stayed there for a few seconds, my heartbeat in my ears, waiting. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer that got startled and ran off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I made my way back to my campsite, walking faster than before, glancing over my shoulder. The fire was still burning when I got back, and for some reason, that made me feel safer. I sat down and forced myself to relax. The woods can mess with your head, especially when you're alone. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, on the sounds of the logs cracking. Then I saw something. Across the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight, something moved. A shadow, tall, still. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and branches swaying slightly in the wind. I stayed up longer than I'd planned, feeding the fire, trying to shake the feeling that something was out there. Eventually, exhaustion won. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. The sounds of the forest felt louder now. Branches creaking, leaves shifting, the distant rush of the river. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Then I heard footsteps again. Slow, careful, close. I held my breath. The sound stopped just outside my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and loud in the quiet. The fabric of the tent was thin. If I reached out, I could press my hand against it. There was nothing but that thin layer of material between me and whatever was out there. Then the tent shifted. Not the wind, not an animal. Something pushed against it. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat there, staring at the shape pressing into the fabric, feeling my entire body go rigid with fear. Then, just as slowly as it had come, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps moved away. I waited. I don't know how long. Minutes, hours. Eventually, the sun came up. I barely slept. When the light started filtering through the fabric of the tent, I finally worked up the courage to move. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was still there. My gear was untouched. Everything looked normal, except for the footprints. They were all around my tent. Deep, heavy, not mine. I packed up fast. I didn't care about breakfast, about the perfect fishing spot. I just wanted to get out of there. The entire drive back, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see something following me. Even when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling. I never went back to that spot. I don't camp alone anymore, and I never forget the sound of those slow, careful footsteps in the dark.